And if there's anybody who doesn't want to be recorded, you can turn your camera off. So George is going to do a few readings from his book and share some other information and ideas with us. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. So that's it. Go ahead, George.
Hi, Lynn. I want to thank Lynn for making it possible to do this in the comfort of our own homes. How about that? Or in my case, in the comfort of her home, since Lynn is my host as well as the organizer of this event. And I'm especially glad that folks have chosen to come into this because I'm here because of a book tour, which is really a kind of worldly contrivance for what my Quaker meeting, Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting, thinks of as my travel ministry for peace and justice. And so I love it when there are special opportunities for friends. Later on, we'll be in a bookstore. I like bookstores too, but I got to say, I love being home, home with Quakers. So I've chosen two very Quaker-oriented pieces of story, really, because this is a storybook, this book that I'm running around sharing. It's a memoir. I decided at 85, it's definitely age to write a memoir if you haven't done it yet. So here, this memoir is published and being read around the country. And I wanted to read a couple of selections from it, short stories that are particularly Quaker oriented. And the first one has it involves a Quaker who I think most of you know personally. Let's find out. A few high school students who were inspired to activists asked Friends Peace Committee for training. I happened to be leading Friends Peace Committee at that time. It was a Philadelphia yearly meeting organization. And youth worker Michael Yarrow agreed to organize a summer project. This is 1964. It was called Students for Nonviolence. I shared with Mike the view of longtime activist and Quaker Charlie Walker that one of the most empowering activities for arousing a movement is street speaking. Mike agreed to try it out, but said I would need to sell it. When meeting with the high schoolers, I told them that Malcolm X developed his movement by speaking on street corners in Harlem, and that Quaker Alice Paul did the same for women's suffrage in the early 1900s in Center City, Philadelphia. The teens were both scared and fascinated, and agreed to try a series of street meetings. Mike assured them that we would first practice before going out on the street. Each Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, we agreed, we would take a milk crate to the same spot across from City Hall, and the students would take turns standing on the box and talking about Vietnam, which was the huge war that was becoming ever greater in 1964. The students knew little about Vietnam at the start of the summer, not unlike most members of Congress. Study was essential, but our pedagogy was far more lively than a classroom's pedagogy. I told the students they would be studying in dialogue with the people. Early in the summer, our students were easy for passersby to stump. Somebody would say, "What gives the North Vietnamese the right to invade the South?" Somebody else would say, "What about the Geneva Accords? Didn't the Accords give the United States the right to be there?" Mike and I loved watching the students dive into scholarly books and articles to learn more and figure out their own positions on the controversies that were raised by people on the street corner. The mainstream mass media were of little help in this study. As usual in the beginnings of wars, the mass media simply parroted the government line. The media would do the same later on Iraq, the Iraq War. In the beginning of the series of street meetings, Mike or I would break the ice by being the first speaker. Then each of the students would mount the milk crate, one after another. Several said it was the scariest thing they had done in their lives. As I watched their power grow, I realized that street speaking was the activist equivalent of a high ropes course in Outward Bound. After a couple of weeks, students began to volunteer to be first speaker. The students designed a leaflet to hand out that had a coupon on the bottom, and they were delighted to find an increasing number of bystanders were sending in checks, asking how to volunteer, and telling us they were recruiting friends to come out to our street corner at the end of the day. The students realized that on the street they encountered many people who wouldn't go to a church basement to learn about Vietnam or to a union hall for the same purpose, but they would stand for an hour on the street learning and discussing the issue with strangers. Midway through the summer, after I turned on the milk crate, I found a spot in the middle of the crowd to listen to a student take a turn. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a hard-faced man edging toward me. I couldn't miss the tension in his body language. When we were almost touching, he turned to face me and looked down. I followed his eyes and saw he was holding an open knife an inch from my belly. "I'm on leave from Nam," he said quietly. "Fuck you." I took a breath and looked deeply into his eyes. "I know you can hurt me," I said, "but first, take a minute to think about the consequences for you." He blinked, then blinked again. He slowly put the knife back in his pocket, edged his way out of the crowd, and was gone. The second story I'd like to share, this really is a storybook. That's what this is. I loved storybooks when I was a boy, and I never lost a taste for storybooks. So this is a storybook, and it's all drawn, of course, from my life. And here's the second one. In 1973, I was becoming known among Quakers nationally, and my positive image included being a family man with a talented wife, 3 beautiful children, and the unstated assumption that I was straight. In those days, if friends knew the truth about me, my image for many would be quite different and negative. My Quaker community was fundamental to me, and at the same time, I increasingly felt that I was living a lie. An opportunity came along that would change all that. Barrett, my wife, and I were invited to be plenary speakers at the 1974 Friends General Conference gathering in Ithaca, New York. So that's about 50 years ago, and Friends General Conference is coming again, this time to the West Coast. Well, that was in Ithaca, New York. It would be a chance to come out to 1,000 Quakers all at once. The very thought started me sweating. We quickly accepted the invitation to speak on the assigned topic, community, and then started to have peer counseling sessions with friends willing to listen and support. We first needed clarity on whether I should come out as a bisexual. We didn't object in principle to compartmentalization. It is not always wise to make the private public. We agreed that individuals do need space from prying eyes, the neighbor's eyes or the state's, to risk, to experiment, to create, to learn. So there is value in compartmentalization, but there might also be a time to report on an experiment, to share the outcome of a risk, especially if making something public helps free others who are oppressed. Weeks and then months went by as Barrett and I turned these questions over in our minds. Increasingly, I sensed that she would agree if I could achieve clarity myself as to what we would say. The reality is that I hate gay oppression and grieve for those that it has killed and maimed and stunted. Even now, as I write this memoir, the violence continues. In 2021, in a middle school hallway, a 13-year-old was slammed to the floor and beaten after the attacker said in public, "I'm going to knock the gay out of him." LGBTQ folks are 4 times more likely to experience violent attack than other people. The number of anti-LGBTQ hate groups in the United States has been soaring. In 1973, when I was struggling with this question of coming out, anti-queer violence was so pervasive that an accurate count of incidents was not even possible. The media reported attacks on us with baseball bats and deaths by stabbing and shooting. My life's purpose is to work for justice, peace, liberation. Of all things, how could I give a pass to this oppression, a burden that has been personal and intimate in my own life? Making the decision freed me to feel more of my walled-off fear, and I spent the spring of 1974 alternately preparing the speech with Barrett and sitting with various friends, imagining giving the speech while shaking and oozing cold sweat from every pore. The big moment came. Ithaca College's field house was filled, and you could almost hear a happy sigh as we appeared with 3-year-old Ingrid. Her older siblings, Christina and Peter, were in another building in the children's program. Ingrid would, in a few moments, be taken care of by the friends who occupied the center of the front row, ready to beam reassuringly at us when we went up to the platform, since they knew what we planned to do. Barrett spoke first. I sat near her, marveling, as I often did, at her poise and clarity. As a speaker, she did not smile as often as I did, and that made the smiles all the more effective. It also didn't hurt that she was so much prettier. After Barrett sat, I felt for a second like quitting while we were ahead. All I had to do was omit the last 2 paragraphs of my talk, and we would continue to be favored by these dear friends, many of them gray-headed, folk dancing, peace pursuing, silence loving, book review reading, quietly chuckling, eyes shining Quakers. Well, my dad taught me that follow through is everything. As I neared the end of my talk, I tackled the value of trust in building community. Trust, I said, can be built deliberately through a process that's simple, although not easy. We can build trust by taking a risk. If the ceiling doesn't fall in, if the ground doesn't open up and swallow us, trust grows. One kind of risk taken in community is self-disclosure. For example, I could take a risk here, right now, by disclosing something about myself that most of you don't know. I could tell you something true about me, that I think of myself as gay or bisexual. I can love men sexually as well as women. That's where I lost it. Although I moved my eyes over the entire audience after saying that, I couldn't stay present enough to see what the reactions were. Later, I learned that some were turning to each other with incredulous looks, while others were clamping their jaws tight. A few, thankfully, began to weep with joy that the unsayable was being said. After a final summarizing sentence about community that no one paid attention to, including me, I returned to my chair. The gathering went into its customary period of silence as my stomach began to ache. Then Baird and I descended the steps to form the typical speaker's receiving line in those days. Whoever wanted to could come forward and greet us. I prayed to become present as friends pressed to see us. Several men rigidly held their bodies under control as they told me how much they detested what I had said. I thought one of them might actually hit me. Other people fell into my arms with tearful gratitude. One older Quaker woman said, "George, I'll have to think about all this for a long time, but I do take you seriously and I will pray about it." As the line to speak to us diminished, our front row friends came forward with little Ingrid. "We're running away with you," they chorused, and we surrendered gladly. 10 minutes later, we were occupying the rear section of Ithaca's best ice cream parlor, ordering outrageous confections and exchanging one-liners. The manager didn't seem to mind how loud and giddy we were getting, since we were spending lavishly on his prize sundaes. "I wonder how Friends Journal will cover this news," my friend Ellen Deacon said. "The Journal's a monthly," Ross Flanagan commented. "I wonder what the rumor mill will do." Later, we learned that within a week, Tokyo Quakers were discussing the night's revelation. "Here's the thing to try," Ellen interjected. "Orange sherbet covered with chocolate syrup." Ingrid was passed around from lap to lap, sampling the flavors. As the party wound down, she came to me, hands and face sticky, and fell asleep in my lap. For some reason, Barrett and I hadn't talked about what the next morning might be like. As we brought our 3 children to breakfast, the massive cafeteria suddenly went silent. The crowd realized what it had done and began to buzz again, clinking knives and forks. I was afraid to look around and busied myself with getting the oatmeal into assorted young Lakey mouths. The stomach ache returned. Suddenly, I was aware of a tall presence next to me. I looked up to see E. Raymond Wilson, standing in his customary gray suit and tie, saying something to us. Gray-haired, blue-eyed Ray was one of the most respected Quakers in the United States, known for his integrity and his judicious mind. Now he was saying something to Barrett and me, but I couldn't quite make it out. Barrett nodded and smiled, and I realized he was talking about breakfasts and children and how it was looking to be a good day for playing outside. He stayed long enough for everyone in the cafeteria to see E. Raymond Wilson having a warm and friendly conversation with the Lakeys. In his low-key way, he was asserting a solidarity that all could see. Then he returned to his seat.
Thank you. Just one word, George. For those many of you who got in late, my apologies for how long you were in the waiting room. My computer was not showing me in the customary way that there were people in the waiting room. So I'm sorry that some of you missed more than you might otherwise have. It is recorded, so you will have the opportunity later to hear the first offering that George made, which was about a story about he and Mike Yarrow, and then to hear the beginning of the sharing he just did about coming out to 1,000 friends at Friends General Conference. So anyway, welcome to those who came late. And I think George is gonna do some more sharing now.
Actually, I'm happy to accept questions. I realize time really moved quite quickly along, and I've never been at an occasion when Quakers didn't have questions to raise.
Well, I still hope you'll say something about equat, because I would love for people to hear about equat
Okay.
or equate. I'm not saying it right.
Equate. We enjoy that, that double meaning. Earth Quaker Action Team, EQAT, plus the word equate. Well, if people aren't leaping with questions, then maybe I should say a word about equate. Yes. So I called people to my living room in 2009 who I thought, Quakers, who I thought would be willing to consider an additional Quaker organization. That's an always fraught situation because Quakers have so many organizations. But what I had noticed was that in the field of climate crisis, climate change, that whole batch of issues that we lump together in that way, I realized that in that area, Quakers had various organizations working on it, but none of the organizations was committed to nonviolent direct action. None of them, indeed, even freed themselves to do that occasionally. They were all working on legislation or education, something of that kind. And I thought, whoa, within the Quaker uh, uh, ecology of organizations, there is this very missing piece. There's a space crying out for attention. And so let's start a Quaker direct action organization to fill that space that would focus on environment and especially on the environment, the climate question. And so the group that came together in my living room, fascinated. We decided to do a series of study about that issue, and also we were watching civil rights movies from the civil rights period. I found have been very, very helpful to Quakers and everybody who wants to know, how do you really do a campaign? Because campaigns are not taught in high schools. They are not taught in college. It's this amazing social invention the Quakers were doing in the 17th century, as early as that. I mean, Quakers were really early in developing campaigns, but most of the world has no clue. And a lot of Quakers these days even don't really have a clue about how to do nonviolent direct action campaigns, which are Dr. King felt, Martin Luther King felt, and I felt, is the single most powerful and effective thing that we can do to make change. And so we were studying how to do that at the same time as we were studying the climate issues. And next thing you know, there we were doing a campaign with regard to one of the primary offenders, which was a target that was also very much within reach. We believed that PNC Bank, which is the seventh largest bank in the country, but is especially strong in the East Coast where we were, that bank, if we targeted it with nonviolent direct action, could be forced to give up its practice of financing mountaintop removal coal mining. Because PNC Bank at that time loved bringing in the money by loaning it at its considerable interest to coal mining operations that were literally leveling mountains with dynamite in order to get the coal. And we thought, okay, we'll go after PNC Bank. And so we did. And we did nonviolent direct action, usually in the banks themselves, but also other means as well, and including shutting down shareholders meetings. It was quite a good time we had. And again, I do describe it in this book. So if you're curious about a very successful Quaker campaign that attracted Bill McKibben and so many people to see, oh my goodness, those Quakers, they really have a lot of juice when it comes to tackling formidable targets, formidable opponents. Yeah, we did actually force PNC Bank against its will to give up that profit source and stop loaning money to coal companies, which meant that pretty much the end of climate of blowing up mountains in Appalachia for coal. Yeah, so that was a very, very exciting campaign. We started, as I said, in a living room. It doesn't require a lot of people to start something, but then the important thing is to grow, 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 grow. And over the 5 years, we grew to the place where we could do direct actions in 13 states, multiple cities, all the same weekend, basically showing the bank we're merciless. We will not stop of confronting your evil practice, and we will just keep growing and growing, disrupting your operations more and more and more until you finally realize, okay, the Quakers win, we lose. And that's exactly what they did. By the
Um,
way, PNC Bank actually didn't go out of business. All they did was lose one of their profitable sources of income.
If people want to ask George a question, you can either raise your physical hand or you can raise your Zoom hand. And for those who do not know where their Zoom hand is, if you move your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you will see various buttons, one of which says reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see a hand button, and you can push that and it'll raise your hand. And well, okay. Oh, there we go. All right, George, you got a whole bunch of them. Let's see. I'm going to call on Louise Lansbury.
Yeah, I'm sure that George is aware of this, but one of the best examples of nonviolent action and how to put it together is the Nashville sit-ins. That is part of a Force More Powerful videos, and you can access it on YouTube. And it's just a case book of how to go about it, and very powerful.
I couldn't agree more. And so accessible, so handy, right?
Okay, Darcy.
Hi, George. Really enjoying your presentation. I'm a former sociology professor who spent a lot of time, my research was focused on nonviolent direct action. So I'm excited to hear these stories, but I had a couple of questions. As a Quaker, well, in terms of the campaign you just described, one was, did another bank just step in and take over lending the money instead of PNC? Two has to do with the Quaker notions of that of God and everyone, and how you reconcile, and I don't mean to be critical, I'm just curious, typical campaign language of opponents and evil and attacking and making war and being merciless with Quaker beliefs in that of God in everyone, and trying to find, instead of a zero-sum win-lose kind of situation, trying to find something that where everyone can benefit in the long run. So I'm curious about how you feel about that as a Quaker doing direct action. And then the last question I had was whether or not your group has been involved or was involved at all with the Standing Rock campaign. And then I'll just quit there.
That's already a great deal, isn't it? So I may not get to all of it, and you may need to come back. With regard to the language, actually 17th century Quaker language was extraordinarily forthright. People, early Quakers called a spade a spade. They didn't mess around. They weren't worried about being nice. So I think the great affection that a lot of Quakers feel for nice language is more a product of class than it is of the Quaker culture and ethos as it was developed in the 17th century. And my preference is for the 17th century version. Because that's actually when we made, when we grew the fastest, when we made the most difference in the larger world, by calling a spade, and I really, really believe that. I don't say we're declaring war on anybody, because I don't think that particular word should be used too loosely, because I know there's a war on poverty and the war on this and the war on that. I think it is used too loosely, because I think that it's important to keep it, you know, I, at least in my own practice, keep it referring to its military dimension. Yeah, but certainly opponent. I mean, I'm happy to say the economic elite is the opponent of all the rest of us, because it's running the country, and it is, if anything, doubling down on a climate catastrophe that is already killing people, killing Americans, as well as killing many people abroad, and will continue to kill at an increasing rate in the future. And if that's not opposition to people who love life, I don't know what else we could call it except opposition. Then the opponents are doing the opposition to life. So I think it's okay to use plain language. Yeah.
She had also asked about whether another bank took over making the loans.
Oh, no, because we very intentionally, that relates to the question of targets and issues and so on. We very intentionally chose something that we thought was one of the weaker sources of fossil fuels that could be, it was maybe on its way out anyway. It was it wasn't robust, not like gas or oil. And my understanding of movement building is that mass movements are developed much more easily through a succession of wins than it is through a succession of losses. I'm not actually fond of losing. And another way that the sit-in movement, the 1960, Black students sit-in movement can inspire us, is that they racked up a series of victories. Sure, they lost some, but they won a great many of them. And that built the mass, because the students were the forerunners in that particular case. But then lots of older people would come to the aid of the students when they were being hurt and so, in some cases killed and so on. And the mass movement grew as a result of a series of wins. So I'm not at all in favor of spending our time on things that we cannot accomplish. I'm not at all in favor of that. I don't think it does give us moral credit. I think a lot of people say, well, if something's immoral, we should get up and witness against it. I don't think that makes any sense. I love the tradition among Quakers of being very practical. In fact, one reason why Quakers in Pennsylvania became very respected by their neighbors was because we tended to come across as very practical people. We were very good farmers, for example. Those Jersey farmers, they really knew how to farm. And they really knew how to mill flour, and they really knew how to do stuff. And the neighbors who say, well, they are very strange in some ways, but they are certainly very effective in the things that they choose to do. And I really love that. So I don't go after targets that seem to me beyond reach. I don't stand up. I do sometimes go on these occasionally called protest demonstrations if I have a gang of people to go with, because we'll have fun. But I agree with Martin Luther King that these sort of spasmodic protests that are simply, moral expressions are a waste of time. Dr. King knew perfectly well. It's campaigns. There's an invention, a technique called a nonviolent direct action campaign, and that's what delivers the goods. So do we want to be effective, or do we simply want to be in my really negative moments, I call it moral exhibitionism. Well, I at least, I'm on this side of God and apple pie and, and stuff like that. I think that doesn't attract me at all. I like people who can get stuff done. And Quakers have, centuries of experience getting stuff done. So let's get stuff done. and not go after stuff that doesn't, it is not effective.
Okay, you've got two more. Charlie, you want to unmute and do your question? You're still muted.
There you go. Okay, thank you. So, George, I'm enjoying your talk so much. Your smile and your laugh is so infectious. It's great. And a few questions, a couple questions. So one, at the banks, what exactly did you do? That's sort of the pragmatic thing there. And then another question is, what are the roots of your activism? Who do you credit that? Where did that come through your parents? How did you come to be you?
It's Jesus' fault. It really all goes back to Jesus in my particular case. It's really his fault. I was brought up in an evangelical church where we were guaranteed to learn about Jesus as kids, right? So I learned about Jesus. I learned what he did. You know, I learned about how he set his face toward Jerusalem, knowing what was waiting for him. I learned how confrontive he was. He was incredibly confrontive. Even as a boy, he was in there, you know, with leaders, picking their brains and stuff. So his whole approach was so and such an initiative taker. Right. And I thought, wow, I want to be like Jesus. Well, of course, the whole church, my evangelical church, was saying we all should be like Jesus. Right. I want to be one of those like Jesus. Well, yeah. So and because I had a gift of gab, even as a boy, the elders of my church, I tell about this in the memoir, the elders of my church said, oh, this might be a child preacher in the making. Because we have had a tradition of boy preacher, right? So let's give George a chance. So they told me I could have the pulpit a month away, and then I would be on Sunday morning preaching a sermon. Oh my gosh, I felt so honored and amazed. Whoa, they think I could do that. So I worked so hard on that sermon. I prayed and prayed and prayed. God, what do you want me to say in this sermon? And the response was very clear. So I got up there and preached that it was God's will that there be racial equality. Now, this is 1949 in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. So I really thought the sermon hung together. You know, it's coherent. It was, a little chirpy voice of a 12-year-old saying this. And then I joined the minister at the end of the service at the front door, you know, shaking hands with people as they left. And nobody said anything except condescension about my sermon. Nobody responded to the content at all. And then the elders of the church who had asked me to do the sermon gathered around, sort of circled around me, and all they did was said goodbye to the minister. And the message was very clear: don't call us, we'll call you. So that was the end of my preaching career. I had a one-day preaching career because I made the enormous mistake of preaching what God wanted me to preach. Racial equality. No way did they want to hear that. So that's my background. And and obviously I'm at age 85, I'm still trying to do what I understand God wanting me to do. And some of that's appreciated and a lot isn't too.
Okay, Joanne is the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for setting this thing up, and thank you, George, for sharing your in such honesty. It's a pleasure to hear you. I have to make a confession. I began to attend the Quakers when I was living in New York, and I got very impressed with the actions of the American Friends Service Committee years ago. And then when I moved to Seattle, that was the first organization that I wanted to join and become affiliated with. But in recent times, I became involved with the issue of nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
And as I try to bring that to Quaker meeting, I'm feeling resistance. I'm not feeling support. I'm feeling resistance, and I question that. And if I look at FCNL and AFSC, they're not mentioning a word about nuclear weapons. And I said, boy, you know, you guys were such leaders in Vietnam. Why has the issue of disarmament kind of not made it, especially now, right? So I know that people have other concerns, and you know, their concerns are their concerns, you know, and I have to respect that, and they respect mine, but I still question why this is off the agenda.
Hmm.
And so I wondered if you have any observations about that.
Right. How about if I just speak to my own choice about that? The very first demonstration I was in, and I was really scared because by the time I did that, when I was 18, I was a college student. I was really scared. A protest had become a scary thing to me, but I participated anyway, and it was in support of the people in the Golden Rule who were protesting nuclear weapons. Testing in the Pacific, right? So I have a long history with that. However, I've never really made it a point of concentrated energy. The reason being, my analysis is that the people who run the American empire, the economic elite, is responsible for us having an American empire, and they run it in their interests. And that's my analysis anyway. I mean, I know people disagree with that, but there's some people who disagree. But more and more people are really watching, and the levers of that control are becoming more and more apparent. They control the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, and so on and so on. Okay, so they love nuclear weapons because they think the empire needs them. And so it's a totally unwinnable at this moment, totally unwinnable issue. And so I regard myself as wasting my time if I go after a totally unwinnable issue, because it would require taking on the economic elite and taking away its power to lead the American empire, so that we don't even have an American empire anymore. And then we wouldn't be using nuclear weapons either. We wouldn't even bother to stockpile them. So what we need to do now is what the Vikings, I don't know if you've run into my book, Viking Economics, but what the Nordics did, the Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, they noticed that they were being run by their economic elite. This is the 19 teens and 20s and 30s. They were noticing that, and they were thinking, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff that's really, really terrible that the economic elite wants, and we don't. So we need to take the power away from the economic elite so we can have sane policies, so we can have what we deserve, like excellent medical care for all. How about that? Free university education, and on and on and on, the things that they've got. But they understood the power situation. They realized who was in charge and who wasn't. So what they did was they took away the power of the economic elite. They waged nonviolent revolutions that overthrew their economic elite. Once they did that, oh my gosh, then all kinds of things were possible that had not been possible. As soon as we do that, call me up. Because then we can get rid of nuclear weapons. But until we do that, until we get the economic elite off our backs, we will have nuclear weapons. And I don't want to waste my time.
Those of us who believe there is another way. And they're trying to do that.
Yes, and I understand. You keep the issue alive. You keep it before us. And that will make it easier once we do the necessary work of power change. That will make it easier to let go of the nuclear weapons. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is from John.
Well, George, a joy to hear your voice, see your face, and as my good friend Charlie Janeway said, to hear your laugh, and also a joy to see so many other friends' faces here. So my questions, I have two, and they have to do with joy. You are the happy warrior in my book, in my dictionary. There's a picture of you on that definition. And at a very deep level, I would like to have you share what's at the heart of that in terms of how do you maintain that? I see so many of us get cynical, burn out, upset, defeated, and we lose that joy. And so comments you have on that, I'd love to hear. And then related to that, which is all about joy, are you going to be doing Broadway piano at FGC in Oregon in July?
Well, you already know that source of joy, right? Music, right? Music. What a source of joy that is, and many friends, I think, really appreciate that. Yeah, so that's one thing. Another thing is that we were noted. The Earthquake Action Team, Equate, was also noted as a joyful outfit. Our singing, our singing culture was very, very strong. Before we were arrested, we'd be singing away. One of the things we learned to do was how to shut down shareholders meetings of PNC Bank. And I will never forget the first time we shut down their meeting. People were stunned. The shareholders, the owners of the bank were sitting next to us. We were scattered throughout the auditorium. So we were sitting next to the shareholders, and we were sitting and we shut down the shareholders meeting. And the CEO, who was on the stage and running things, said, "This meeting is adjourned." It was after 20 minutes. It's supposed to be an hour and a half meeting. And everybody was stunned, including us. We thought, whoa, this is an easier victory than we thought. And so in the middle of that stunned silence, my daughter Ingrid starts singing, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." So the 16 of us who were these troublemakers, we of course, that's our theme song. So we join in with Ingrid and we're all singing it. And then people are getting up and they're starting to head toward the exits because the meeting's over. And I look around and I see some of the shareholders just singing, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." So a group that is willing to be joyful in its expression and its source of power is also infectious. And that's one reason why we grew and grew and grew and grew from a living room to 13 states. We grew partly because we were pursuing an objective that could be achieved. And a lot of practical people in the world love to get stuff done, but also because we created a culture of joy. And I was just part of that culture. So, but part of creation of that culture. Okay. The other part of what keeps me going is that, as my family can tell you, they can walk into the kitchen in the morning. There I am over my, granola, right? Reading the morning newspaper and crying. That's the other thing I do. I laugh a lot and I cry a lot. Because truth to tell, there's a lot to cry about. So I think that I doubt very much that I would be laughing much if I weren't crying, frankly, and beating on pillows, and kicking. I don't kick dogs. Certainly don't kick people, but I kick the mattress. So I think that we need to honor our physical selves as well as our spiritual selves. And it's okay for us to express ourselves. I'm not saying I'm not trying to make legislation about what others should do, but I'm just finding that it's tremendous help to me to honor everything that's going on for me. And then that enables me to really enjoy the joy or express the joy.
Thank you, George. You didn't answer the second question,
What was that?
but I'll let you go on that.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Are you coming to FGC?
yeah.
Oh, it depends. I'm increasingly worn out by the book tour. I'm 85. 85-year-olds shouldn't be doing book tours, right? So I will probably be a limp rag when FGC is happening in Oregon and absolutely refusing to move out of my house. But I'll be playing Broadway at my house.
Okay, it looks like Louisa has another question. Can you unmute? There you go.
Yeah, well, I hope this is okay to ask a second question, but you opened yourself up by saying that the fight against nuclear weapons at this point of history is probably unwinnable. But you said we need to, first of all, take down the economic elite.
Mhm.
So of course, the next question is how?
And have I ever written a book for you? Because
right.
you are not the first. You are not the first to ask that question. It is such a great question. It's a great challenging question. So I was being asked in 2016, 17, I was being asked exactly that question. I really love that question. And so I wrote a book. And the present publisher, my present publisher of this book, the memoir, Dancing with History, is so generous because instead of just saying, okay, this book tour is only about that book, I said, hey, can I promote How We Win also? And they said, go for it. And it's because my present publisher understands we're really in a jam, right? I mean, we really are up against it in our country. And so we also, so it's fair enough for me to be also promoting this book. And frankly, now don't tell the publisher this, but I've been in bookstores where more people have bought this than bought the memoir because it's a handbook, it's a kind of Red Cross handbook on what to do in emergencies, and that's what this is about. Yeah,
Okay.
if I guarantee you, if even 30% of Americans followed what's in this book, we would take care of the economic elite, and then we could get rid of nuclear weapons. So if we get that 30%, I'm telling you, the economic elite is toast, and we will get rid of nuclear weapons. But until we do that, so let's just go ahead of that. So let's all just read this, apply it, and then take on the economic elite. And yeah, yeah. I don't even hate them, I'm lovers with a millionaire. I said he didn't come out to me for 2 years as we were getting to know each other and getting to love each other. He kept wearing his thrift store clothes. And he was in drag, he was in disguise because he figured, well, working class George, there's no way he can be interested in me if he knew I was a millionaire. So finally, in the most shy way, it was very sweet. He finally came out to me, and you're like, will George love me? And yeah, what are you going to do?
Okay. So I'm going to ask a question now. So I would love, you talked about EQUAT's mountaintop removal campaign, but you guys are on now the third campaign since then, and campaign number 3. And I would love to have you describe to the group the process that you all use to decide on a whole new campaign, because I think the process that you guys use is fascinating.
Right. You did mention the second campaign. We lost that campaign. So one of the things Dr. King also taught was, hey, you can win a campaign, you can lose a campaign, right? So, and just like the sit-in movement, there were sit-ins that were successful and sit-ins that were not. So we won our first campaign, lost our second. Now we're on our third. We were asked to join the third by an international coalition that had decided to take on Vanguard. And this is of particular interest to Quakers because so many Quakers, I've discovered, have a really good opinion of Vanguard. In many ways, it's an exemplary investor and assurer of our futures when we grow older and so on. So a lot of people have a stake in Vanguard. A lot of Quakers have been writing to Equate, to Earthquaker Action Team, saying, hey, that's where I am in Vanguard. What do you want us to do? Do you want us to transfer to another? We say, no, stay there, because we're going to have, from time to time, not only will we do direct action, and we've already started that, like we had a Quaker worship service at the front lawn of the CEO of Vanguard. The international headquarters is near Philadelphia, so that's why we were invited. That's why we were asked to take that leadership in our area. But also at the same time as we were having worship, London Quakers were having worship with regard to Vanguard. So already we're part of an international deal, and it'll take an international deal, an international campaign to be able to force Vanguard to give up its enormous affection for coal. Vanguard loves coal, loves oil. loves gas. So you have this contradiction. The reason why we think we can succeed on this campaign is because Vanguard has this enormous contradiction between, on the one hand, saying we are going to assure your future, and on the other hand, what they're busy doing, of course, is destroying our future. Maybe not the future of the 80-year-olds, but certainly the future of their children and their grandchildren. And that contradiction within Vanguard's very own core is a contradiction that we can work and I think succeed with. You'll probably enjoy the website of eqat.org, eqat.org, because that's where we lay out the nature of the Vanguard campaign. And of course, Quakers all over the country can be part of that, and Britain as well.
Darcy.
Thanks. So I have another question that comes up. It has to do with the nonviolent direct action tactic and the choice of using it at this point. I mean, I've done it over the years many times myself. I've been involved in a number of campaigns, one of which was very successful, the German anti-nuclear waste campaign and anti-nuclear campaign. And I think campaigns are the way to go, but I also get very nervous nowadays, especially as polarized as the United States is politically, when I see the far right adopting these tactics. And it's wonderful to be disruptive and you know, when you think you're on the side of right, but then when you see things like a few years ago when some of the right-wing militants took over the national park, for example, and said, you know, this is our land, we believe in private property, blah, 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 right? So it is by nature a very confrontational tactic and doesn't allow a whole lot of room for negotiation, for noticing and recognizing and respecting the needs of the other people on the other side. It's more about forcing them to do what you want by getting in the way. And there are times when I think that's absolutely necessary, but in this particular polarized climate, I worry what's going to happen when the right starts employing this tactic at the same rate as we are, and what happens when you just get the two extremes at loggerheads. Which we already are in all of our political institutions, right?
Right.
So I'm just curious as to what you think about that as a tactical question.
Right. Oh, it's such a great question. I have a perspective. I would love it if you checked in with Lynn to get my email later, and so that you could give your response to a perspective that I've been putting out during the whole book tour, and not having a chance to get perspective back from folks like you with regard to this unusual picture of polarization, which is, I guess, a term we can use, right, for all this right versus left, highly confrontational, increasingly so, right? Okay, so a dozen years ago, I was noticing that, yes, indeed, there is this growing polarization in our country, and it looks like it's going to get more and more. It was my prediction of it. And I was feeling worried, just as you are. You know, like, how can we make forward progress if people are at loggerheads and disagreeing and so on? So I was really worrying about the polarization that I noticed. But at the very same time, I was also doing the research for this book. Okay, and I was interested not just in how the Scandinavians have pulled off such superior societies to ours, but of course I wanted to know that, but also I wanted to know, how did they get there? Because 100 years ago, Norwegians were coming here, right? And Swedes and Danes and so on. They were getting out of town because their societies were a mess, and ours provided so much more opportunity. So talk about a turnaround. So I wanted to know, when did they make their big leap? And what was going on? What was their secret sauce that enabled them to go from way worse than the United States to way better than the United States? Like, how could they do that? When did they do it? How did they pull that off? What I found out was in the 1920s and 30s, they pulled off their nonviolent revolution. Okay, so that makes sense to me. If you've got an economic elite that's blocking you, you got to get rid of it. That's what you just have to do. And it doesn't mean that you get rid of it in the Russian Revolution way of killing people. The Nordics are very decent, like we are. Well, like Quakers are, right? They're decent. So they didn't tell their economic elite, go to slave camps or something. They said, hey, you're going to have to learn to live on an economic in a place where there's democracy, and so get used to it, and you may not be, and you won't be able to get untold amounts of profit. You'll only get to have more than any of the rest of us, but it still will be moderate amount. And so they were very, very human, very, very human with the people that they overcame through their nonviolent revolution. And I would like it if we were very human with our people too, who are so misguided, and I would say distorted and misshaped by the fact that they grow, that they're born into $100 million trust fund or whatever it is. And that's what I would like to see. And the only way to do that is through conflict. There is no demonstrated way. Please show me one case in history in which the economic elite has been talked out of its domination, or a king has been talked out of its domination, or a dictator has been talked out of its domination. That, if you please show me some historical cases, then I will think you're in reality. If you can't, then I think that you're fantasizing. So that's I'm just trying to be very, very practical and very tough-minded. Now, the good news about the polarization. Okay, so there I was exploring how it was, there they were doing this 1920s, 1930s dance that overcame the power, took away the power of the economic elite and created actual democracy. Well, what was going on at that time? What was going on at that time was the biggest polarization. Now, this is what shocked me. The biggest polarization that they had experienced in modern times. The communists were organizing for the dictatorship of the proletariat in Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And at the very same time, Nazis were on the move, marching, growing, delighted that Hitler thinks Aryans are better than other people, right? And that's going to appeal to the Nordics. And so there were very, very attractive and growing Nazi parties, and at the same time, very attractive and growing communist parties in those countries. Tremendous polarization, tremendous conflict. And that's when they made their big leap. That's when they got the job done. Now, what shocked me was I had no way of understanding that. It just defied my understanding of the requirements for making progress. So I thought, okay, George, so if you're so stymied by these very clear historical examples of enormous progress made under conditions of heavy polarization, keep looking for more case studies because you love case studies. So I thought about the 1930s in the United States, which was the decade when I was born. What was going on? Nazis were filling Madison Square Garden for rallies. Communists, it was the glory period of the American Communist Party. Tremendous right and left wing polarization between those two. Tremendous. Workers taking over corporate factories and so on and so on. Tremendous degree of conflict. What came out of the 30s? The arguably greatest period of progress that we made in the first half of the 20th century. Now I'm even more amazed. What? It's not only the Nordics who are maybe crazy, but it's the Americans too, who make enormous progress in the polarization. Well, keep looking for case studies, George. Keep looking. So then I look at the 60s. What happened in the 1960s? The American Nazis made a return. Ku Klux Klan bombing, right? Killing like crazy. Tremendous lot of bombing going on in the 60s. The right wing was wild. Left wing was growing like crazy. especially in California, they seem to be doing some really nutty stuff. But anyway, really, really rapidly growing left wing, tremendous polarization in the 60s, assassinations, bombings, the whole works. And we can argue the 1960s, which sloped into the 70s, was the greatest period of progress that we made in the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so I am beside myself. This is not making sense to me, right? But at that moment, I was also, while I was befuddled, I was also doing book tour for this book in Britain. And in Britain, I was being put up in the hospitality of an artist, a Quaker artist, who had recently taken on metal as his preferred medium for doing art. And I was wandering around his big old Victorian house, seeing these gorgeous artistic creations. And I was saying, man, how can you do this with such a stubborn material as metal? I'm sure it doesn't want to do what you want to do with it, but you're making it do this gorgeous stuff. How do you do it? And he says, oh, George, let me show you. Come on out through the kitchen. Out through the kitchen we go, out into the backyard. That's his studio. Here we go into the studio. He proudly presents his forge. He says, yeah, I had to apprentice to a blacksmith. I had to learn how to heat the metal. Because you're right, metal doesn't want to do what I want to do. I have to heat it, make it malleable, make it squishy. Then I could work with it. And I say, thank you. I mean, I'm ready to kiss the guy. I don't think he would have accepted it. I was ready to kiss the guy because I said, you have given me a metaphor that I have needed to understand what's going on in my country. The polarization we're experiencing now, the greater polarization we will experience, but also the polarization of the 30s, 60s, also the polarization of the Nordics. You're saying, or I'm getting, it's a forge. That's what polarization is. It's a forge. It heats up society. It melts norms. We've seen a lot of norms melted lately. It makes institutions malleable. So we could conceivably have an election in the United States in which the minority wins. The minority candidate wins, right? We don't even know if we'll have another free election. That's how malleable institutions become in a condition of polarization. That's the forge at work. So a forge, by heating society, makes it possible to make bigger strides than can be made at other times, bigger forward strides from a point of view of peace and justice. It also makes it possible to make worse conditions, right? So in Germany, they have polarization in the 20s and 30s, same time as the Nordics. What do? Do they go to a land of social democracy? They go to They go to the Nazis. They go to Hitler, right? Italy, same thing. Polarization, the forge is working, it's heating up society, and in the 20s and 30s, the Italians go to Mussolini and the fascists. So the forge, I'm now getting it. The forge doesn't care. You have a judgment about polarization. I know. I had exactly the same judgment, a negative judgment about polarization. Polarization is a forge that is value neutral. It doesn't care what the outcome is. If you want to make horseshoes with metal, that's fine. Be a blacksmith and you will turn the metal into horseshoes. Good luck. That's all right with the forge. If you want to be an artist, the forge will work for you. If you want to make junk, the forge will work for you. It is value neutral. So the real question about polarization is not, does it feel good? It feels terrible. That's one reason why I cry over the morning oatmeal. I cry because there's so much suffering that goes on during polarization, as it did for the Nordics, as it did for us in the 30s. There was tremendous suffering that went on in the 1930s in the US. There was tremendous suffering that went on in the 60s, right? The point isn't to focus on the suffering. The point is we will suffer anyway. That's guaranteed. That's built in. The forge does that. If you question the metal, it would probably say, yeah, it really hurts in here. We don't like being heated, right? So it's not a question of whether we like something. The question is there opportunity there for progress? So my perspective, my sociological conclusion from the case studies I'm aware of is that this is now increasingly, because I think we've gone beyond, or we are going beyond the polarization of the 30s and 60s in the United States. I think this is the biggest opportunity of my lifetime to make forward progress, to make a realistic person, instead of a dreamer, out of members of your meeting who want to get rid of nuclear weapons. At long last, this is not just a dream. This is a potential reality to make really big steps forward by relying on the forge and taking advantage of this moment and using our opportunities. And I'm so excited to be 85 and still here because I get to be in on it. I get to be with you folks who are on this call right now. We get to do this together. We get to be in what I think, in 50 years, people will look back at and say, that was, whoa, those folks took on the greatest opportunity in American history to make a decent society instead of an empire. Thank you, they will say to us, because you used the opportunity instead of just belly aching about it. And that's our moment. So I would love to get email from you about, since this is your question, but also, happy for any dialogue that happens among Quakers about this perspective. Because if I'm right, it really invites a way different way of looking at this year and next year and next year and next year after that.
Well, thank you, George. George had indicated to me that he wanted to run about an hour, and we're over that now. So I think this is probably our wrapping up time. I have put into the chat my email because I do not have the emails of everybody who's on here. If you were one of the people who arrived late and you want the recording, please email to me so that you get that. My email is lynn@fitzhugh.org. There is a hyphen between the Z and the H. And as I said, it's also in the chat. So as John Helding mentioned, it is very lovely to see so many friends that we haven't seen for a while. So thank you all for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to join us. Any final thing you want to say, George?
Just that you've noticed me getting very excited in my presentation, and that has to do with how intensely I feel about all this. I think it's actually one of the things that keeps me alive at 85. And also, it's my evangelical background. It'd be fun to blame my evangelical background for all this evangelical enthusiasm. What do they call them? The Methodist enthusiasm. I've got that Methodist enthusiasm down in my heart. That's what we used to sing. Yeah. And I hope you'll forgive any bumps along the way. But you got a guy who's just going to be very genuine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And I put a couple of comments in the chat that might be of interest to you. And I'll get in touch. I look forward to having a more conversation.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.